The first snow came early that year, brushing the pines in a hush of white and clinging to the iron-spined ridges above Widow's Hollow. It fell like ash over the valley, softening the jagged skeletons of long-dead trees and quieting the old ghost trails that wound up into the mountains. In the stillness, every breath hung in the air like a question no one dared ask. And in the house at the end of the hollow, nestled between a crumbling fence and the bones of a barn, Ruth Alder moved like someone learning how to live again. It had been 7 winters since her son died. His name was Eli, and he'd only just turned 15 when the bullet took him down by the river bend. Ruth had buried him herself, shovel blistering her hands as she dug past the frost, her fingers going numb while the preacher muttered words that meant nothing at all. There were no witnesses, no trial, only a name whispered through town with equal parts certainty and shame, Calder Reddick. The man vanished after it happened. No one knew where he'd gone. Some claimed he drowned in the river trying to cross into Mexico. Others said he took his own life in the burned-out church 2 counties over. Ruth never believed any of them. Some part of her was always listening, waiting for something, a sign, a mistake, a ghost. The ghost came just before dawn. She'd been out in the Linta-gathering wood, breath misting in the frigid dark, when she saw him standing in the clearing past the fence. Pale coat, black hair matted with snow, face hollow with hunger or grief or both. He didn't speak, just watched her like he didn't believe she was real. Ruth dropped the bundle of wood. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't run, didn't scream. Her body held still, but every memory in her blood was screaming her son's name. He didn't look like a man back from the dead, but he didn't look alive either. In the amber glow of her oil lamp, she saw his eyes, and the name came like a bruise rising to the surface, Calder. She took a step forward. Her boots crunched the snow. He flinched, and his mouth opened slightly like he meant to say something, but no words came. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was low, ragged with the edge of frost and years of silence. "What do you want?" He looked down, then back at her. His voice cracked from disuse. "I didn't kill him." The wind carried the words away almost as soon as he said them, but Ruth caught them, felt them lodge like splinters in her throat. The ground didn't shift. The snow didn't melt. Nothing changed. And yet the world inside her rearranged itself all at once. "Liar," she whispered, but her hands didn't reach for the rifle behind the door. She just stood there, rooted. He stepped back into the trees, like a shadow retreating at sunrise. That night she didn't sleep. She boiled tea but didn't drink it. Just sat in her dead husband's old chair by the window, watching the frost gather on the glass, waiting for the ghost to return. The next morning there were tracks by the barn, barefoot, half-melted, and a single mark near the doorframe, as though someone had rested their head there for a moment. She told herself she should ride into town, tell the sheriff, but something kept her from saddling the mare, something soft and terrible like hope's broken cousin. 3 days passed. On the 4th she found him again. He was huddled beneath the linta where the snow couldn't reach, trembling like a dog left in the cold too long. His lips were blue, his coat stained with something darker than shadow. Ruth didn't ask what. She crouched beside him, jaw clenched so tight it ached. "You don't get to haunt me," she said, "not unless you're ready to tell the truth." He lifted his head. His eyes were wet with fever or sorrow. "I tried to stop it, I swear." She didn't believe him, not fully, but she couldn't leave him to die. So she dragged him inside. As she stripped the coat from his bones and fed him broth by the spoonful, she told herself this was not mercy, it was justice. She wanted answers, wanted to look him in the eye when he confessed. But when his hand brushed hers, weak as paper, something in her chest twisted in a way she hadn't felt in years. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of something worse. Recognition. She tucked him into her dead son's bed, stoked the fire with hands that trembled. And for the first time in 7 years, Ruth Alder prayed. Not for peace, not for vengeance. She prayed that the truth, whatever it was, wouldn't kill her before morning came. By morning, his fever had broken. The sweat soaked into the cotton sheets, the same ones Eli used to sleep under, left yellow stains like old light. Ruth sat by the bed, her hands idle in her lap, fingers twisting around themselves as the shadows slipped across the walls. The fire hissed and popped, but Calder didn't stir. When he finally opened his eyes, he looked less like a ghost and more like a man returned from someplace beyond the edge of memory. His voice, when it came, was sandpaper soft. "You should have let me die." Ruth didn't answer. She only poured water into a tin cup and set it by the bed. Her silence wasn't forgiveness, it was restraint. Outside, the wind was rising, the kind that carried needles of ice and warnings in the branches. A storm would come by nightfall. She'd need to chop more wood, check the roof again. And still, she sat there, watching the man she should have hated. Later, she brought him a boiled potato and half a biscuit. He ate slowly, eyes on the window, as if afraid to look at her too long. "You gonna turn me in?" he asked. "Not yet." He nodded like he'd expected as much. They spoke little after that. Days passed. The storm came and swallowed the world in white. The snow buried the fence, the barn roof groaned under its weight, and Ruth kept the fire burning. Calder moved little, coughing sometimes, mostly sleeping. Each time she changed the water basin or smoothed the blankets, her mind flicked back to Eli, how his body had lain broken near the riverbank, mouth parted like he meant to call for her. She never saw him die, only the blood in the reeds, the empty air where his voice should have been. Calder didn't ask for her forgiveness, he didn't beg, and that, more than anything, kept her from throwing him out into the cold. One afternoon, she found him sitting up, arms wrapped around his knees like a child. He flinched when she entered, but didn't speak. Ruth set down a bowl of beans and leaned against the doorframe. "You said you didn't kill him." He didn't look at her. "I didn't." "Then why did everyone say you did?" He ran a hand through his tangled hair. "Because I was the one who brought him there." The silence was immediate, heavy. Ruth's breath hitched. "I didn't pull the trigger," he said, voice raw, "but I might as well have." She took a step forward. "Tell me." So he did. They'd been hunting, he said. Calder had taken Eli under his wing that autumn, teaching him to trap rabbits, skin deer, read the sky. Eli had looked up to him, eager and bright-eyed, and Calder, young then, not more than 20, had felt a strange pride in it, the kind of feeling that made him want to be better. But Calder had enemies, men who didn't take kindly to his past, his blood debts, his gambling, his father's name. One of them found them that day, thought Eli was bait, thought Calder was hiding something in the boy. The shot wasn't meant for Eli, it wasn't meant for anyone. But the boy stepped in front of Calder, trying to stop the fight before it began, trying to be brave. The bullet tore through his chest. "He died before he hit the ground," Calder said, his voice cracked like a thawing lake. "And I ran, not because I was guilty, but because I couldn't stand what I'd brought on him. I was a coward." Ruth stood frozen. Her legs shook beneath her, not with cold, but with the effort of staying upright under the weight of everything unsaid. She thought of Eli's letters, how he'd written about Calder, how he'd admired him. She thought of the way her son had smiled when he spoke of learning to shoot, to trap, to be a man. She wanted to scream, to tear the walls down, but instead she asked, "Why come back now?" Calder looked at her then. His eyes, bloodshot and too old for his face, held no hope. "Because I see him, every night. I hear him calling my name, and I don't want to run any more." Snow rattled the windows. The wind keened against the chimney. Ruth turned away. That night she dreamed of the river, of Eli's voice calling to her from the shallows. When she woke, her pillow was damp with tears. Days passed in slow ritual. Calder regained strength. Ruth spoke little. Her heart beat like a war drum under her breast, unsure which side it fought for. And then came the sound of hooves. 2 riders approached from the ridge, rifles strapped across their backs, faces wrapped in wool and suspicion. Ruth saw them from the porch and felt something coil tight inside her. They were looking for someone. She could see it in their stance. She stepped off the porch, snow crunching beneath her boots. Calder watched from inside, half-shadowed by the curtains. One of the men tipped his hat. "Ma'am, we're tracking a man, thought he might have come this way." Ruth's heart was still. "What's he done?" she asked. "Stole from the wrong folks, got a price on his head, name's Calder Reddick." She didn't look back at the house. Her voice was calm. "No one's passed through here, snow's too deep." The man nodded slowly. "You sure?" "Sure as I can be." They stayed long enough to drink her coffee, long enough to make her stomach knot with every word exchanged. But they left empty-handed. When they were gone, she stepped back inside. Calder stood in the parlor, face pale. "You lied for me." Ruth closed the door behind her, bolting it against the wind. "I didn't lie," she said. Then, quieter, "I just haven't decided what justice looks like yet." And for the first time, Calder looked at her not with fear, but with something close to awe. Like a man seeing light after years in the dark. The snow began to melt in fits, slow and reluctant. It bled down the gutters and soaked the ground, uncovering bones of things long buried, a rusted tin pail behind the barn, a child's boot half sunk in the mud, the stump where Eli once tied his slingshot targets. With each drip and sigh of thaw, the land began to breathe again, and Ruth felt something inside her shift with it. Calder started walking, not far, just to the fence line and back, his limp still stiff from cold and weeks of fever. Ruth watched him from the porch some days, her arms crossed, face unreadable. She did not trust him, not with her thoughts, not with the silence they now shared. But she no longer flinched when she heard his steps behind her. He offered to help, quietly, never insistently. He chopped kindling, mended the broken hinge on the smokehouse door, cleaned the stalls where the last of the hens still roosted. His hands worked with the weary rhythm of someone who'd forgotten how to belong, who labored not to earn forgiveness, but because his bones needed the doing. Ruth said little, but she watched. One morning she found him in the woods beyond the fence, crouched beside the creek where the ice was breaking into jagged petals. He was carving something, a small figure, whittled from pine, shaped with the care of reverence. He startled when he saw her. "It's nothing," he said, closing his palm around it. She nodded but didn't press. Her eyes drifted to the water instead. "That's where they found his scarf," she murmured. "He didn't move." "I buried it with him," she said. "I thought maybe, if he had something warm, it might matter, wherever he went." Calder knelt beside her then, not close, but close enough that she could hear the breath catch in his throat. "I carry his name," he said. "Not the way I should, but I do." Ruth didn't answer. Her grief was a long corridor with no door at the end. That night Calder placed the carved figure on the mantel. It was a sparrow, wings tucked, head bowed. Ruth didn't ask why. She only stared at it for a long time, the firelight dancing in its wooden eyes. The days stretched longer. In town, word had begun to stir again, men speaking Calder's name with narrowed eyes and curled lips. But none dared ride back up to Widow's Hollow. Ruth had earned her solitude through suffering, and few were brave enough to trespass against it. Still, danger circled like wolves beyond firelight. One morning, Ruth returned from the root cellar to find Calder standing at the edge of the porch, rifle slung over his shoulder, face pale with resolve. "I need to leave," he said. She stared at him, arms full of turnips. "Why?" "I'm a ghost here, you know it. I feel it every time I walk these floors. I can't bring back what I took, but I can keep worse from following." Ruth set the turnips down. The wind tangled a lock of hair across her cheek, and she didn't brush it away. "You think leaving will fix it?" "No," he said, "but maybe it'll keep the hounds at bay. I don't want anyone else caught in the crossfire." She stepped forward, close enough to see the lines around his eyes. He was younger than he looked. Guilt had aged him more than time. "I should hate you," she said, "and maybe I still do, but you're here, you didn't have to come back, that counts for something." He looked away, jaw tightening. "I can't make it right," he whispered. "No," she said, "but you can stay and try." His breath hitched, then slowly he lowered the rifle. They didn't speak again of leaving. That week she asked him to teach her how to shoot. "I've got my father's rifle," she said, "but I never had to use it." He nodded. They went out past the pasture, into the clearing where the snow had receded and the earth was soft with spring rot. He set up old bottles on a fence post, showed her how to brace her shoulder, how to breathe before pulling the trigger. Ruth fired, missed, fired again, the bottle shattered. She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased. Calder offered no praise, just reloaded the rifle and handed it back. They fell into rhythm. She began to walk with her head higher. He began to speak with less caution. Small things, like the story of his sister who drowned, or the way his mother used to sing while cooking beans. pieces of a life he hadn't shared with anyone in years. In the evenings, they sat across from each other by the fire, her mending shirts, him carving sparrows. 5 now sat on the mantel, each one shaped a little different. One had a broken wing. The past still hovered, heavy as ever, but it no longer pressed her to the floor. One night a storm rolled in, lightning dragging claws across the sky. Ruth woke to the smell of smoke and the snap of burning wood. Calder's voice was in her ear before she'd fully risen. "Fire in the barn," he said. "You get the pails, I'll get the mare." They moved like they'd practiced for years. She tossed water from the rain barrel, he dragged soaked blankets over the hayloft. The flames licked the rafters, but they beat it back. In the smoldering dark, her breath ragged. Ruth looked at him, shirt soaked, hands blistered, and something inside her broke open. She reached for his arm, held it, not tight, just enough that he'd feel it. "You stayed," she said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The storm passed. The barn still stood. And in the hush that followed, Ruth Alder began to wonder what it meant to share a roof with a ghost who no longer wanted to haunt, but to atone. The air turned warm and wet, thick with the scent of thawed earth and green things trying to crawl out from under the ruin of winter. Crocuses pushed up like bruises along the fence posts. The creek ran faster, louder, as though it too had something it needed to confess. Ruth woke each day to birdsong instead of silence, and for the first time in years, the sound didn't hollow her out. She began to laugh again, though only in small, startled bursts. Once when Calder startled a pheasant out from under the porch steps, and it exploded upward like a shot of God's own mischief. Another time when she caught him trying to cook and watched him chase the flames licking up from the pan like they'd personally insulted him. They lived like this, not quite together, not quite apart, moving through the house like coals that refused to die, waiting for the breath that would make them burn again. Still, Ruth kept her guard. Love was a dangerous thing. She'd given it freely once, and the world had taken it like a thief. It wouldn't get her so easily again. Then came the letter. She found it wedged in the barn door one morning, tucked into the crack like a secret. The handwriting was rough, slanted, unknown. No return name, just her own scrawled in dirt-flecked ink. She opened it with fingers stiff from milking. Calder watched from the path, hands muddy, axe slung over his shoulder. She read it twice before speaking. "They know you're here," she said, voice low. He stepped forward. "Who?" "Someone who wants to settle old scores." Calder closed his eyes. His shoulders sagged like the words had weight. "I'll leave." She didn't answer right away. The letter still fluttered in her hand. "No, not yet." He looked up, startled. "If they're coming," she said, "then let them. I buried one son already. I won't bury another, not even one borrowed by blood." He blinked, as if stunned by her choice of words. That night they loaded the rifle and set new locks on the doors. Ruth sharpened the hatchet, laid traps along the path to the ridge. Calder built a trip line using twine and old cans. It was not fear that filled the house, but preparation. They didn't speak of what might come. They sat by the fire like before, but this time she leaned close enough to feel the heat of his shoulder against hers. Neither pulled away. On the second night, the dog barked. Ruth didn't own a dog. She rose from bed, the rifle already in her hands. Calder met her at the door, his face drawn and grim. 3 men stood beyond the trees, half-shadowed in moonlight, the gleam of metal winking at their hips. She opened the window just enough. "You've got no place here," she called. A voice came back, smooth, southern-touched, oily as lamp grease. "We're just looking to collect, nothing personal." Ruth's hands steadied on the rifle stock. "Everything's personal when you bring it to my door." Calder stood beside her now, not behind, beside. The voice answered, cold and amused. "Well then, let's make it personal." A shot rang out, shattered the top pane of the window. Ruth ducked. Calder was already moving, drawing her back, shielding her with his body. The rest happened fast. He went out the back, circling wide through the trees. She stayed at the front, rifle braced on the sill, watching the brush with breath held tight between her ribs. Another shot, then silence. Then cries, a scuffle, and Calder's voice hoarse and close. "He's down," one of them ran. Ruth burst from the house, lantern swinging, found Calder kneeling over a man, face bloodied, breathing ragged. One hand clutched his chest, the other curled in the dirt. "You knew this would happen," she said. Calder nodded. "I just didn't think it would happen here." The man on the ground spat blood, looked up at Ruth with something like disbelief. "You protected him after what he did." Ruth stared down at him, then quietly, "I'm not protecting him. I'm choosing what kind of world I want to live in." He laughed, a broken sound. "Doesn't change what he is." "No," she said, "but it changes what I am." They buried the man the next morning. Ruth marked the grave with a stone and a prayer, though she wasn't sure to whom. Afterward, Calder sat on the porch, silent, hands stained from digging. She joined him, setting a mug of coffee by his knee. "You still think you should have run?" she asked. He shook his head. "I never should have left in the first place." She looked at him then, really looked. Not as the man who'd vanished the day her son died, not as the shadow that stepped from the trees that winter morning, but as the man sitting beside her now. Bruised, quiet, not redeemed, but still trying. And in her chest, a fragile thing stirred. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe the shape of it. Maybe spring came in earnest, slow as syrup and twice as sweet. The valley opened its arms again, wildflowers blooming in cracks between rocks, the river full and clear, its banks soft with moss. Ruth planted beans along the fence line, watched the corn push up in careful rows, and found herself humming not songs, but pieces of breath shaped like music. The kind a person forgets they still carry. Calder stayed. He rebuilt the chicken coop, sanded the porch rail where rot had set in, patched the saddle that Ruth had given up for ruined. She never asked him to. He simply saw what was broken and tried to mend it. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but he always tried. And she, God help her, let him. They ate supper together most nights now, not across the room, but close enough to pass the butter without speaking. Sometimes she caught his eyes on her, not in hunger or hope, but in a quiet kind of witnessing. Like he was memorizing the shape of her, the way one might study a landscape before leaving it forever. One night when the air was thick with the scent of lilac and old smoke, Ruth asked him, "Did you ever have someone waiting for you, before all this?" Calder was slow to answer. His spoon circled the edge of his bowl. "A girl long time ago, before I lost my name to the wrong kind of stories. She wanted a house, a garden, the kind of life I only knew how to ruin." Ruth watched his hands. They trembled just faintly, the way a tree shakes before the wind makes it bend. "What happened?" "She waited," he said. "Then she stopped waiting." Ruth didn't speak. The fire cracked low between them. Later she found him sitting out under the stars, a tin cup in his hand, the carved sparrows lined up on the porch rail like sentries. She sat beside him, knees brushing. For a long time they said nothing. Then Ruth whispered, "Eli would have been 22 this summer." Calder nodded. "He was a better man at 15 than I've been my whole life." She turned her face toward the sky. The stars were sharp tonight, the kind that made you feel both small and seen. "I used to think grief was a straight road," she said. "But it's more like a river. It loops and turns, and sometimes it dries up, and then one morning it comes roaring back, washing everything clean or away." Calder looked at her then, "And what's left?" Ruth smiled, faintly, whatever was strong enough to hold. A week later, a boy came up from town. Barefoot, red-faced, carrying a parcel wrapped in old canvas. He handed it to Ruth without a word and ran back down the ridge. Inside was a letter, short, careful. "Heard you were harboring a ghost. Some of us think maybe ghosts deserve a chance to finish their stories." No name, but Ruth recognized the handwriting. It belonged to a storekeep wife whose son had been pulled from the river by Calder years back. The kind of mercy no one talked about but never forgot. She handed the letter to Calder. He read it once, then again, then folded it slow and tight, like he meant to keep it in his pocket until the ink wore away. "You think this means they'll stop coming?" he asked. "No," Ruth said, "but maybe they won't all come with guns." That evening she cooked rabbit stew and poured 2 cups of cider. They didn't toast, just sat close while the wind moved through the trees outside, gentle now, like it too was tired of fighting. The next morning, Calder didn't come down from the loft. Ruth waited, brewed coffee, listened. Stillness. Her heart thudded as she climbed the ladder, found him lying there, pale, face slick with sweat. The fever had returned. He tried to speak, but only groaned. Ruth worked fast, cold cloths, water, herbs crushed from the garden. She sat beside him as he burned, whispering things she hadn't said in years, not prayers, not forgiveness, just the truth of her presence. "I'm here," she murmured. "I'm here, I'm not leaving." For 3 days he drifted between worlds, eyes fluttering, lips dry. Once he muttered a name, not hers. A brother, maybe, or a ghost from some other life. She didn't ask, she just stayed. On the 4th day, he opened his eyes. Saw her. And smiled. It wasn't a bright thing, it was worn, fragile, but it reached her all the same. "You didn't let me die," he whispered. "No," she said, touching his brow, "not this time." And she knew, as she held that fevered hand in hers, that she no longer waited for him to confess or suffer or vanish. She waited for him to live. Not for her, but beside her. If the world would allow it. By midsummer, the valley ripened. The sky turned a heavy blue and the grasses bent with bees. Ruth walked barefoot through her garden rows, hem damp with dew, fingers stained from tomatoes and beetroot. The days were long and slow and full, the kind that left her too tired to ache and just empty enough to feel peace creep in. Calder healed, his fever broke for good. The strength came back to his limbs and the hollows under his eyes faded. He still moved with caution, but not from pain, from reverence, as if each moment might break if he stepped too heavy through it. He kept carving sparrows. 17 now stood on the mantel. One morning, Ruth caught him sanding a piece that wasn't a bird. It was a horse, half-shaped and unsure of itself. "Trying something new?" she asked, leaning in the doorway. He didn't look up. He used to talk about horses. Eli said he wanted to ride to Colorado one day just to see if the sky was bigger there. Ruth nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch between them. "You remember more than I thought," she said. "I remember everything," Calder answered. And she believed him. They rode into town together weeks later, first time since the snow fell. Ruth wore her son's hat, the brim softened by age. Calder walked behind her at first, then beside her. The streets were still, eyes watching from windows. A few folk turned away, but others, quiet, plain folk who remembered kindness more than blood, nodded their chins, and Ruth returned it with a steady gaze. They sold turnips, traded eggs, picked up nails and kerosene and cloth. Ruth bought sugar she didn't need just because she felt like baking again. When they mounted the mare to ride home, she caught a flicker of movement, children chasing a hoop down the alley. One stopped, staring at Calder wide-eyed. "You the man who saved Josiah Tanner?" the boy asked. Calder looked down, startled, then nodded. The boy gave a crooked grin. "Mama says not all men stay bad." And then he was gone, swallowed by sunlight and dust. Neither Ruth nor Calder spoke on the ride home. But that night, Ruth baked cornbread and left the windows open to let the smell drift out. Weeks passed, then months. Autumn stirred, the leaves rusted gold, the sparrows on the mantel multiplied. Calder added a wolf one day, then a doe. He gave her the wolf without a word. Ruth set it on the windowsill, facing the woods. They shared everything now, chores, meals, silence. Sometimes he'd read aloud from her son's books. Sometimes she'd sit beside him on the porch with her knitting, not saying a thing, just breathing in the same space. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was kin to it. And then one morning, Ruth found him gone. No note, no tracks, just the back door ajar and a single sparrow missing from the mantel. Her breath caught like it had in the years after Eli's death, a sharp, ragged pain. But this time, she did not collapse. She waited. 2 days later, he returned. Dust on his boots, blood on his collar, his eyes hollow with travel. "Why?" she asked, standing firm in the kitchen, heart thundering. "There was a man, the last one, the one who pulled the trigger. He was living in Dry Bend under another name." Ruth stared at him, and Calder swallowed. "I faced him, told him what he took told him I forgave him. She said nothing. Her hands trembled at her sides. And then, she whispered, and then I walked away. Ruth closed her eyes. You left me without a word. I had to, he said. If I told you, you'd try to stop me. You're damn right I would've. He stepped forward, because you care. She looked at him then, tears pricking like stars in the corners of her eyes. Because I've buried too much, she said, and I don't know how to bury you too. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. I'm done running, Ruth, from him, from Eli, from you. Her breath shuddered. She led him to the hearth, sat with him by the fire, said nothing for a long time. And then, as night wrapped its arms around the hollow, she leaned into his shoulder. Not because she needed saving. Not because he had earned it. But because they were still here. Because sometimes ghosts do not come to haunt. They come to be held. And at last, in the home where sorrow once took root, something tender began to grow in its place. A second life, quiet, unpromised, but wholly, fiercely real.